This theory, the broken windows theory, has been around since the 1980s, and it basically says that signs of petty crime, like broken windows in a neighborhood, will encourage further crime, whereas if you have a clean, well-maintained environment, this shows that crime isn't tolerated. So, the principle is target the petty crime and antisocial behavior, and this will reduce not just the petty crime, but serious crime as well, because one leads to the other. It was tried out in New York in the 1990s, and the crime figures for that period did show a significant fall in both minor and more serious crime. So they do seem to support this idea, although, of course, it's very difficult to really establish the cause in these cases. The problem with this theory for me is that it all seems rather superficial. I think any serious student of social science or policing methods would want to ask, but why did this vandalism or antisocial behavior happen in the first place? We want to look at social issues like poverty or unemployment as possible causes, and the theory doesn't really address that.
The 19th century saw a huge rise in literacy in Britain, and with it the burgeoning demand for books. The cost of a complete novel would have been way above what most working people could afford, and so this meant many novels were published in weekly parts. That made them much more accessible. And as well as this, there was a new mass market for cheaply produced sensationalist works. These were the so-called penny dreadfuls, stories of violent crime or the supernatural, which of course often only cost a penny. A lot of this stuff is out of print and pretty much unread today, but it would be amiss to think there was a clear divide between this and what we now think of as the classic works of the period. Several critics described how servants and working people would avidly read the early Dickens novels and queue up to buy the next installments. And if we look at some of the great classic novels of the 19th century, like Oliver Twist, there's a sensationalism and there's a delight in the grotesque, which owes a lot to this strain of cheap popular fiction.
The conventional theory of the Big Bang is that the universe started between 13 and 14 billion years ago. What has generally been accepted is that there was a very hot and dense group of particles, and this group filled all of space, at least all of space as we know it. And then the particles expanded quickly. Scientists believe that this expansion was relatively even throughout space. Thanks to findings from the Planck satellite, we can now be more precise about the age of the universe. We can be confident that the universe is around 13.82 billion years old. Research and analysis have helped us to better understand what the Big Bang was, and we can be quite sure that it actually happened. However, what we don't know is whether the universe really began with the Big Bang, or if it existed in some form before the Big Bang. There is evidence to suggest that the explosion was not necessarily the beginning of existence, but rather just the start of our local universe. This line of thinking describes our observable local universe as a pocket universe, within a never-ending amount of dense material that existed long before, for some reason, the Big Bang happened.
I'm going to be talking today about the current state of the automotive industry, with a focus on what's currently happening in our industry, what issues we're trying to solve, aims and dreams when it comes to pushing forward with autonomous vehicles and so forth. And so a huge part of the motivation for many in the industry is obviously making money and the economic and entrepreneurial opportunities. But in a wider sense, it's also about increasing areas like mobility and efficiency. We want to help people who can't travel around easily, whether that's to do with their age, ability or location, to give them access to easy ways to travel. And we want to make that travel far more efficient across the board for everybody. Something nearly all of us hate when it comes to stress and movement is of course traffic. And so how can we make that time in traffic or in transport a productive time into something positive? And of course, we then come to the most important aspect of autonomous travel, for me at least, which is safety, and finding ways to prevent crashes that result in fatalities or injuries.
If we do not create the conditions for sustainable growth, we will be more exposed to rising energy costs, more dependent on finite fossil fuels, and more vulnerable to those resource risks. Instead, we have a chance to build a new kind of economy, a more balanced, more sustainable economy where climate stabilization and financial recovery are not mutually exclusive but mutually beneficial, delivering jobs, creating exports, and securing investment, tackling the deficit without sacrificing the environment, protecting us from the economic and environmental risks of runaway climate change, and all the while maintaining energy security in an increasingly volatile global market.
The confectionery industry has become a multi-million-dollar business. The earliest evidence of humans choosing sweet products for their diet can be found in the artwork on Stone Age cave walls. Early men used to raid beehives to collect honey and bring it back to the community. There is some evidence in Persia and India of people enjoying milk-based products sweetened with honey. Meanwhile, in Europe, where we are today, many of the earliest sweets were intended for medicinal purposes, and the recipes that we have found appeared in the notes of apothecaries, who were early versions of the modern-day chemist or pharmacist. The therapeutic value was added by introducing herbs and spices to the mixture. They were often found to relieve coughs and sore throats, much like a honey and lemon drink might these days. Many of the earliest sweets would be unpalatable to modern tastes, and it was only towards the 18th century that the medicine and confectionery trades separated into two distinct industries.
I don't think it's possible to overstate the influence of digital technology in art and design and how quickly that's evolving. So, as teachers in schools and in museums, we are faced with the challenge of integrating this digital technology into the classroom. And it's essential to integrate this technology now if we want to give students the skills and confidence they need to use technologies and to navigate life in a digital world. But in doing so, we are faced with more challenges, particularly when it comes to cost and choice. This technology often doesn't come cheap. And in a market flooded with apps, how can we tell which ones are good?
Ballet became a really important part of American childhood over the course of the 20th century in a series of stages. I think one of those stages was in the early 20th century in the wake of Russian dancers like Anna Pavlova and Diaghilev's Ballet Russe touring the United States. They went all over the place. They went to large opera halls and they went to small venues. And so many Americans actually had some exposure to ballet during that period. And in a very American way, many of the people who saw those performances thought to themselves, I want to learn how to do that. And they were able to do so in growing numbers because many of the dancers on those tours, the people who danced with Pavlova or on the Ballet Russe tours, settled in the United States after their performance careers were over.
These days, many young people look up to certain athletes and sports stars, such as footballers, swimmers, and tennis players. In fact, many young people may consider these sports people to be their heroes. But is this a good thing? Well, it is if these heroes behave well. This is because they can make the young person want to be like them. At a time when a young person is thinking about what to do in their future, the influence of their sporting hero could mean that they want to achieve great things. At the very least, the young person would hopefully want to play the sport of their hero, rather than just watch them on TV. Even just reading about their hero or watching a TV program about them can help the young person to understand success and failure. They may never be a sporting hero themselves, but they may realize that hard work is needed to achieve their own goals.
Most testing at universities takes place to see if students can recall facts. But although I don't think anyone would deny that students need to acquire some factual knowledge, a university education isn't just about being able to retrieve particular facts or statistics at a given moment. It isn't even about being able to construct a rational argument. Students go to university because they want to be admitted into their chosen profession. To some extent, this has to mean developing the right personality, the necessary maturity, and the right worldview. It's a process of becoming. But how do you ascertain whether a student has gone through this process? Certainly not with traditional testing methods.
I had been to Australia once on a holiday before deciding to come and study here. I come from a vast metropolitan area, and so I've been used to a fast pace of life. I wanted to study in another country, like my own, which encompassed a diverse range of cultures and identities. So for me, it was imperative that I chose a city similar to my own. The benefits of studying in another country are wide-ranging, and it is such an enriching experience that I would recommend anyone contemplating it to find out more about what their target country can offer.
When applying to a university, one of the most important factors to consider is whether the organization offers the subject you're interested in and the possibility of being accepted. In order to know this, a substantial amount of time needs to be devoted to research. This may take the form of checking the university websites or visiting the campus to gain a clearer impression of the place and whether you might be comfortable there. That should result in increased motivation for the arduous tasks of sitting the required exams or writing essays that are part of the admissions process.
Editing your own work can be a challenge. Understanding language rules is key to helping you spot your mistakes, especially when it comes to grammatical errors. Look out for agreements with your verbs and do not forget to check the use of fixed phrases. Another important area to check is word choice. In academic writing, you must ensure that you do not use slang or informal language, as you should always use a formal register. Finally, if you find that you have used the same word many times, try using synonyms to help improve your writing.
Cultural anthropology is the study of human societies, cultures, and their emergence around the world. Its focus is enculturation and socialization, as well as practices and faith systems in different regions. One of the first anthropologists in this field proclaimed that there is no direct relationship between culture and race, as his ethnographical research began to illustrate. Over the years, this branch of anthropology has adopted the idea of cultural relativism.
In certain countries, the use of animals in advertisements is conventional. There is one obvious reason for this. The attention of many groups of people can be exploited by the use of animals. Dogs appear very often because of their popularity, and they are the animal most often found in the home in many countries. An image of a puppy can be enough to boost trust in a brand, no matter what original message the marketing company wanted to communicate. The idea that a brand doesn't take itself too seriously is immediately suggested when a dog is shown driving a car. There are many ways that marketing managers have taken advantage of our love of pets. Language extinction happens when a language completely disappears because there are no living speakers of the language. Experts are worried about the number of languages which are disappearing around the world because it also means that important cultural ideas are lost. Language extinction can happen for several reasons. For example, when young people move away from their home regions or villages for practical reasons, many of them decide that they no longer need the language they grew up with, particularly if it isn't widely known in other places. This leads to a huge drop in the number of people who will pass the language on to their children.
We all know that plastic waste is a serious problem which affects the whole world. It can cause pollution in the oceans, harm wildlife, and affect air quality. However, some governments are changing their laws to try to improve the situation. For instance, they can make large companies which manufacture high quantities of plastic packaging pay additional taxes. However, more steps need to be taken, and some countries are starting to do this. One of the main solutions is to decrease the amount of plastic waste which developed countries send to other regions of the world.
Whether we are conducting research or listening to a news story, statistics are often used in order to provide evidence for the claim being made. Even with marketing, the use of statistics has an important role. For example, say you see an advertisement for a product that states that 75% of people agree that this is the best product they have used. What does this actually mean? It might sound like many people like this product. However, if we know that only 4 people were asked about the item, this would mean that only 3 people were in favour. This is a much smaller number than we might have initially thought.
Some of Shakespeare's earlier critics were quite nonplussed by his last plays. Here we have a dramatist who writes a series of history plays reflecting political dilemmas of the day, often highly controversial ones, then goes on to write some of the darkest tragedies in the language. And then, in his last plays, what does he do? He seems to retreat into a kind of second childhood. Dreamlike, episodic plots, stories of fantastic voyages, magical creatures, miracles. Bored with reality was one critic's conclusion about him. But actually, these plays contain psychological traumas just as deep as anything in the tragedies. Look at the portrait of nurtured grief in Pericles, or that jealousy in The Winter's Tale, which is every bit as destructive as anything in the earlier plays. So there is no way we can say that in these last plays, Shakespeare just turned his back on
Although the importance of green technology, such as solar energy, wind and hydropower, is becoming more widely recognized, and this technology is gaining momentum in becoming more widely used, there are still numerous barriers to cross before it can become truly reliable. Take, for instance, solar power in certain countries. Research has suggested that smog caused by increasing air pollution and cloud cover contribute to the solar panels becoming
Currently, over a third of the world's landfill sites comprise construction and demolition waste. This is what is generated when buildings are constructed or demolished, or when infrastructure is built. This has led to calls for the industry to minimize waste and become more resource efficient. To reduce the amount of waste ending up in landfill after demolition, circular construction aims to convert building components that are nearing the end of their service life into resources for others. The reuse, recycling, repair, and remanufacturing of materials, coupled with policy measures, regulation, and investment, should ensure the construction industry
Teachers and librarians usually share a common goal, a love of reading and a sense of responsibility to pass this love of books on. They recognize how important reading is to enable a child to grow intellectually and emotionally, since it is through stories that children build knowledge and an understanding of themselves and the world. A book can encourage children and help them stop seeing reading as a requirement, but rather they can develop a genuine desire and a need to read. And once they understand their part in a wider culture of literature, they hopefully will then become
How do the brains of bilingual babies differ from monolingual babies when they hear language? Well, neuroscientists recently revealed key differences by conducting research with babies that are growing up in a household with 2 languages and babies growing up with 1. They spoke both French and English to the babies to note their reactions and brain functions. The results showed that the brains of bilingual babies were able to process the sounds of both languages and react equally to both, whereas babies that grew up in a monolingual household could only react to 1 language and more slowly, and their brains showed no signs of response to.
The term innovation is at risk of becoming a buzzword. Popular blogger James Harper has suggested that the word itself is problematic, as it is used to cover too many different aspects of a complex range of ideas. He has recommended breaking down the concept of innovation into types, not completely new or distinct types, but just subcategories of the idea of how to innovate. Chief among those is the association of innovation with process, strategy, and management technique. At the same time, though, the idea has also been strongly linked to the more abstract concept of creativity, a term that's just as hard to pin down. Experts generally concur that innovation done well leads to increased job opportunities, profit, and better standards of living, but it will be hard to develop strategies to encourage these things.
The word poison may create images of murder and tragedy in the mind, but the power of poisons to also heal has been understood for centuries. Just 1 teaspoon of the botulinum toxin, for example, could kill the whole population of the UK, and yet it's become the basic ingredient for treatments of muscular problems, including its latest fashionable use as a popular wrinkle treatment, Botox. The yew tree, which is deadly poisonous, has been found to have the potential to save thousands of lives by slowing down the growth of cancer cells. These examples and others are challenging the concept that poisons are an instrument of death. Far from it. And although small doses of natural poisons have been used to relieve the pain of surgery or to treat coughs for centuries, modern science has become much more successful in recent years at isolating the properties of these plants and putting them to use in medical treatments. As a result,
I am a chartered psychologist. I've taught psychology really from for everything from young people learning difficulties through to postgraduate level for about 25 years. I've also done some work on transitions between different levels of psychology, done some research there. And really, this book is a kind of product of.
As architectural complements go, it would be rather hard to beat the French historian Auguste Choisy's description of ancient Greece's Parthenon, as he referred to this temple as the supreme effort of genius in pursuit of beauty. Of course, Choisy isn't alone in his praise of this famous Athenian landmark. Though the Parthenon inevitably needs almost constant restoration and can be undeniably overcrowded during peak tourist periods, for many this site